have Dr Michael Fraser. And so, good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Tina. How are you?
I am very good. So, Michael, you are in charge of the training, is it, and engagement for IOD?
That's right. I look after the training courses and events, and also our branch network. So we get to hear all sorts of interesting things happening in the world of governance and beyond.
Yeah, so the IOD, for those listeners who don't understand acronyms, and fair enough, is the Institute of Directors. And it is I think it's the preeminent body really for standards of directors and governance in this country. I'm pretty right about that, aren't I?
I think so. We've got a membership of just over 10,000, 10,500. Wow. We do advocacy work, some learning, training, mentoring programs, and the list goes on. But we'd like to think we're at the heart of good governance there.
Yeah, and I'm one of your pupils, students, customers, and did a course in Auckland in 2016 or 17, I think it was, in Auckland. Yeah. They're life-changing.
That's correct. Well, I think that it's also just an enabler for people like yourself, because the real contribution is made by people like yourself who serve with those organisations, whether it's a trust board or a board of directors. They're important positions. They've got they make critical decisions that impact people's lives. So it's important we've got the right people making sound decisions and with the right skills.
Yeah, and the courses are thorough, but everyone talks about the one thing that they don't sort of sell, but is actually really important, is you network with a whole heap of people from very, very different perspectives, and you coalesce for a whole week, and you're doing nothing but talking and analysing and listening together. And I think that's the great joy of that week-long course, is you learn so much from other people as well as the content of the actual course, which is, in one part, I think is incredibly scary, and you go, whoa, the liabilities are pretty out there, whoa, to the, wow, I can do this, And so I think from my perspective, it's still one of those courses that I put a big tick beside as one of my favourite times in my life was doing that course. Just as simple as that.
That's great. I think you hit it head on there in saying the joy, because if you want the information, you can walk down to a library and get a book out on it. It's actually that humanness, that interaction, that joy. So. No, glad you had a great experience. And a lot of our people who go through that course do, and they still keep in touch many years after the course has finished, or they organise to catch up for dinner and alumni. So there's some great stories that have come out of that. But it's about connecting with people, and it's a little bit like flying an aeroplane. If you can't be a pilot and safely step into the cockpit in the same way, if you were doing these board simulation kind of experiences, which is what we sit, as you'll know, we sit around and do, they're nice, psychologically safe places that you can try out what you've learned. You can exercise. How do you cover off those responsibilities? Because you don't want to do that in real life and find you've got it wrong.
No, you don't.
To do in a classroom kind of setting amongst trusted peers. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've got more courses than just that week-long one too. So you've got chairs courses and all sorts of other stuff going on as well, so people can continue. In fact, you're actually geared towards getting people to continually educate themselves.
Yeah, and also the other, we've got some sort of entry level, because there's this imposter syndrome that you see come through in a lot of really talented people. They're reflective, they know what they know, they're often quite humble, and so just to dip your toe in the water and say, hey, is this for me? Is governance for me? Or they might be interacting with a governance type environment. So you don't need to be sitting on a board necessarily. Great governance occurs with lots of different people involved, so it's important that all those people have access to it, but the most important aspect is people have fun and learn something in the process.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's a text just come through and it says, great subject, taking it all in with notes. As I've been voted onto a couple of boards with large debts, always learning, this 59-year-old, if they had large debts, I'm not sure whether I'd be that bloody keen. And that is an issue. I mean, and that is one thing that I think is canvassed really well in that week-long course is, you're it, really, in terms of liability. And that's a good thing to know right out from the outset.
Yeah, and there's a few curly ones that people might not appreciate until they're actually there in the class. Carol, is you don't have to be on a board to have board responsibilities. So you might think you're not a board, but you're acting like a board, and under the legislation, you're deemed to be. Can you
give us an example of that? That's a newie for me.
So you could be, for example, as part of an advisory group, but if your advisory group is making decisions in the capacity like a board and assuming the roles and functions, it's possible that it could be considered as a board. So there's all these really quite, things that are really important to know before you step into some of these governance positions.
Right.
But at the same time, and you'll know this from having different roles, Tina, they're enjoyable, right? When they're going well, they're not easy, but you're making a contribution.
Yeah, but the one of the reasons why I contacted the IOD was there's two boards that I'm sitting on which are quite different. One's not a board; it's actually a Māori authority, which is probably what you're saying is acts like a board, and it has a young, vibrant group of people. Some who have governance experience and some who don't. And it's operating very well. And because it's young, like we've got a lawyer on it, 2 scientists, management experts and all sorts. And it's a very high-functioning, what I think is a very high-functioning organisation. And I sit on another board, and I'm the youngest at 64, and a lot of them are over 70, and the last 3 AGMs we've had, no one's put their hand up to replace us. Now, as I said before on the program, that could be literally because people think we're doing an okay job, but I think there's a much deeper problem here, and that people are not stepping up to organisations because they are worried about the time it's taking and the responsibilities they have. So is IOD seeing this across the board? Because talking to a few people, it's definitely a problem within some of the Māori organisations.
Yeah, the individual dynamics change from board. Overall theme, we're seeing a huge amount of really talented people. Now, if those really talented people are being matched up with boards, that's sort of a matchmaker type of activity or recruitment activity, but there may well be other things at play there. I'm not noticing it as an overall trend, but dynamics within certain industries or types of boards, definitely, that does come to the fore. And
I wonder too if it's got something to do with the sort of pay or recompense that you get for being on a board. So some reasonable, and people chase those, and I can understand that if you're wanting to be a professional director, but the people who are on NGOs or small organisations that don't pay very much, I'm wondering whether that's where the problems are, is that it's like you're taking on a big responsibility but you're actually not being compensated for it.
It's possible. There could be many different barriers to entry. I think probably the biggest one is what I would refer to as like a socialisation type of process, in the same way that if you're part of a family and mum or dad were a doctor and you'll go on and be a doctor, there's elements of how much you know about it and how easily you can enter that kind of, because there's a few myths around governance. So one of the myths could be that there's, overbearing kind of liability. And while there is, if you understand that, it's fairly straightforward to navigate on most occasions. Now, whether people have that and they have access to the training, there's some of the issues that we're really thinking about, but they're access type issues. I mean, we do our directors' fee survey.
Yes, yep.
And that's yielding some quite interesting results. We haven't closed off yet, so we're just working through what that is. But what we've seen in recent years is those demographics changing. So our pipeline of new directors and people sitting in any kind of governance capacity is changing, but it's changing in different ways across different industries at different times. So, for example, we're talking about an increase in female participation in governance, and that's a bigger percentage, and it's a bigger percentage in our membership. It's not changing at the same rate across industries. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And you've got no real idea as to why?
Well, there are some clues in there. So if we look at the public sector, we've got female participation over 50%, and that's because there's legislative tools, I suspect, at play there, and it's supported with mentoring schemes or initiatives within there. But the trend's generally changing right across. It's just the rate at which that's changing.
Right. And in terms of, so if you're like a 30-year-old and you're thinking about governance, what's the best route to take in terms of getting there? Yeah, good question. I think if you're a 30-year-old, I think there's probably three things you can do. I think the first step, and I think this is the most important, is work out your why. So, Tina, you're on boards, and you've mentioned a couple. Consciously or unconsciously, you've chosen those boards, or perhaps they've chosen you, or a mixture of both. But it's working out that why, because if it doesn't, if you don't sort of feel, something towards that, it doesn't mean something to you, it's going to be too much of a heavy lift, because being on a board or any kind of governance position, like you alluded to earlier, it's not a get-rich-quick kind of scheme. No.
It's fulfilling in other ways, but get rich quick is not it. So I think first step would be work out your why.
Yep.
I think the second step, which you've also alluded to, is capability. So whether that's informal training or formal training or somewhere in between, and that training could be informal in the sense of mentoring or going along to events or networking, or it could be formal like the course you talked about. I think getting told up and understanding those responsibilities, because you might not want that. So understanding what you're in for. And then I think that the third is get involved. And getting involved could look like turning up at events with like-minded people. Where's your tribe? If you're into a particular type of industry or a particular type of governance setting, there will be groups associated with that. We run a whole host. So we've got a young directors group that we got recently together in Auckland, and they talked about some of the shared challenges that they have as a younger group around how to access. So seeking support out in a way. But I think work out your why, get told up, get involved. I think that's that would be my very high level words of advice.
Yeah. And in terms of mentorship, is there a mentor program where you've got very senior governance experts who are mentoring younger people? Yeah, we've got a few programs involved, one of which is our Future Directors. So our Future Director program places people on established boards for about a year to a year and a half, and they actually sit on that board. They don't have the same legal responsibilities, but it's actually getting an insight and actually seeing it unfold. And it's quite a nice, there's not a huge number of places, but that's been a really rewarding experience. And we've got others, which is a program we run with community governance, and that is Tua Kana Taina, where it's a chair mentoring program, right? Where we have mentors and mentees, and we've got some training in there, and then they have also specific one-on-one mentoring as well. So there's a couple of different initiatives we've got, but then there's also knowing people, and that
network that's important as well, whether that comes out of a course or an event.
Oh, totally. I absolutely, totally agree with you on that. I mean, I ended up with, I've got one of the people I went through the Institute of Directors on my board at the Masterton AMP show grounds, which is really interesting because he's there because he's a really good, he's done a lot of the stuff. So it was really good having him on board, but I would have not known him if I hadn't have met him on that course and sort of worked out that he had done a lot of high-end business management stuff, and so I just sort of kept my eye on him to see when he was going to be available, so that we could nab him basically, and got him to come on a voluntary board. So that's just one example of that course and that camaraderie and understanding of people, because boards are about teams, aren't they? And I think a lot of people don't understand that dynamic. You have to have a very high-functioning team.
Yeah. Performance on the board, because of that collective decision-making. So, you might be Tina voting against something, but the rest of the board vote for it. You still have the responsibility as if you did vote for it.
I know, and I struggle with that with council, because council doesn't have that same collective, they don't get it. And so the politics comes in play, and even though the majority votes for something, the others can go and say, no, we don't agree with you, didn't vote for it, so we're just going to be a pain in the arse. And that's what happened. And I found that very challenging in local government, that if you come to collectively to a decision as a council, then if you didn't vote for it, you should still support it, because that's what should happen. So my experiences on boards wasn't being reflected in that local government arena, and I think it's something that does need addressed in local government as a result. But yeah, it's a very good point.
Yeah, and some boards will work for some people. And that interview process is particularly important, and also working out who, just like any kind of sports team, there's different positions on the team. You can't have everyone the same size as a prop on there. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit of a skewed game, or it's only going to work under some conditions. And boards are like that too. If they're going to be high performing, you're going to need different people in different positions, albeit collectively making the decisions and collectively accountable, but each having different skill sets within it. So
yeah, and that's a really good point. And I think one of my big takeouts from being on boards and learning stuff as you go is you really need someone who has a deep understanding of finance, and especially in that sort of non-government in any board really, but that it's just so critically important. Everyone can sort of understand a balance sheet, but you really almost need someone who has a forensic ability to be able to understand where the trends are going and what's actually happening, and being able to analyse that. And I've always found when you've got one of those on your board, you've got another sort of level of safety if you haven't got somebody like that on the board.
Yeah, I think you're right. And being an accountant myself, or having the accounting training, although at times as the accountant you have to take people back to, hey, I am the accountant, I am doing a deep dive in this, and I perhaps know what questions to ask in greater depth than others, but you all assume that responsibility too. So
exactly.
But you're right, you do, and often with law, but then there's also technical, tech, IT, cultural, comms, increasingly the HR people, some of the things that have dropped out of COVID in terms of talent and securing the best talent has been the rise of that. It's always been important, but it's particularly important given where we've just been, and even considering some of our supply chain issues or people issues. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely challenging. It was definitely a bloody challenging time for being on a board anyway. Crikey.
oh my. Look, and that was my most favourite time in working for the Institute of Directors, is actually through COVID. Operationally, really challenging, but at the same time, we're interacting with this group of people in challenges we've never had before, and getting that behind the scenes, fascinating. Just fascinating, and even just how people did that, the kinds of, and the speed at which it was evolving.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, an amazing experience.
Well, we had a tourist operation, so you can imagine what that was like on Stewart Island. So that was, and you thought, well, everyone's facing exactly the same challenge here, so we've got to learn from other people. And, you know, we retrenched quickly and did what we had to do, and we preserved our position. And interestingly enough, we had the most successful time coming out of COVID when everyone wanted to go into their bucket list around New Zealand, because we were on Stewart Island and that was on their bucket list. So we did all right in the end, but we'd preserved the organisation and we'd had a bit of retained earnings, and, you know, we worked very, because it was a joint venture, and so it worked pretty well, and we got through it to the point now we were looking at expansion. So I learned a lot. And so sometimes I like, and I suppose I'm a bit of a chaos merchant too. I like it when there's something bad happens, because it means you've got to find a solution. And I like working at pace with people who can work at pace. So I was a bit like you, quite enjoyed that bit.
Yeah, it was good. It was not, like you say, not without the challenge, but throughout a whole lot of really interesting things, like we're used to perhaps one or two businesses or a percentage of businesses going into revenue shock and perhaps even falling over. Fortunately for you, it didn't. But we're not used to it at that kind of scale. And so that threw up things like some of the rules around, can you operate while insolvent, which we know that you can't. And so if businesses are technically insolvent, you can't have your whole economy falling down. So there was some legislative intervention there to just make sure on an interim basis
they could
go forward. And but that's why I love this job, because it throws up all those kind of interesting debates, and you've got a front row seat to what's happening in the world.
Yeah, you do, and it's and it is a bit of a club, I suppose. It's a bit like the RMA Hearings Commissioners Club. I think that's the same thing, and the Good Decisions course, I think, is another one that I think is very good. And anyone who's a director who's got any involvement at all with RMA issues should do that course, and because it's just so pivotal on development and anything that you're doing in business, as the bloody RMA will come up and bite you on the arse sooner or later. So it's quite a good course to do, to understand what the issues and the problems are, and how you can deal with them. Sorry.
No, understanding what it's about is critical. Although the only thing I'd add to that is, in terms of a club, we might be a club, but we're a pretty broad club, increasingly diverse kind of club. So a club with room for everybody, as long as people can meet the standards. Because I think that's what gives some kind of strength.
It's definitely the standard. Hey, look, Michael, thank you very much. As I said, I had this perception that we've got a bit of a problem, and maybe it is a Māori thing because we don't have the level of the depth yet of the people, or maybe they're just too bloody busy too, I think, sometimes, for those organisations, and that's why we're struggling to get new people to come on board. Or maybe we're not selling the opportunity well enough either, and that's something I've been sort of grappling with lately. Our boards, it's cool, it's fun, and it's lively.
It could be those things, but I can assure you, Tina, that the talent's there, both those with the cultural capability, whether it be Te Ao Māori or beyond. They're there. I think it's sort of a matchmaker, and I think it's about challenging some of those myths around what is governance, because incredibly hard work, but incredibly rewarding too. So
absolutely. Hey, look, thanks again, Michael. And if there's any changes that you'd like to promote at some point, just let us know. Because I think as an organisation, the Institute of Directors has a high standing and a high level of trust in the community, which is great. And I would never realise that there was 10,000 members. That's a bloody good solid base. Look, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tina. Much appreciated.
And that was Dr Michael Fraser from the Institute of Directors. There you go. See, I had a perception that there was an issue with young directors or getting directors on boards, because we're struggling with an organisation to attract new talent. So maybe it is us not marketing ourselves properly, because what he's saying is there is a very good pool there of trustees or directors that we could call on. So I might have a rethink about that.